"I buried my husband 41 years ago," she said, not looking at me. And somehow, this silence still feels lonelier. Asterisk, her voice caught me off guard, low, warm, and completely unafraid of truth. I had only come to return her mail, a flimsy envelope that had ended up in my box. I hadn't expected to be invited in, much less told something like that before I'd even stepped over the threshold. Yet there I was, standing in the doorway of a weathered white house that smelled faintly of lemon balm and old books, staring at a woman who had just cracked her life open like it was no big deal. Asterisk, I was 27, tired, and newly moved into the rental 2 houses down. I'd been crashing after a long stretch of startup. Burnout, a tech job in Chicago I couldn't force myself to care about anymore. I didn't tell people that. I just said I needed a break and found this quiet neighborhood near the lake, figuring a few months out here might fix whatever was hollowing me out from the inside. Asterisk, but nothing much was fixing me. Days were long, hours empty. I slept too much, drank too much coffee, walked without a destination. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loud in a different way, like it was waiting for something I couldn't name. Asterisk, and then came that day. That envelope, in that moment, standing in front of a woman who looked at me with tired kindness and said something nobody else ever dared say out loud. Asterisk, you can come in, she added, finally turning toward me. It's too cold to be standing in doorways. Asterisk, I stepped inside like I was sleepwalking. The air in her house felt different, warmer, softer, not just because of the heat, but because of her. She moved with slow grace, not the kind you see in women trying to impress, but the kind that comes from someone who's lived enough to stop pretending. Her hair was silver but thick, pulled back into a loose bun. She wore a blue cardigan that matched her eyes that looked straight into me, like they didn't mind what they found. Asterisk? I'm sorry, I mumbled. I didn't mean to intrude. Asterisk, you didn't. It's just a little mail. She smiled faintly. Though I suppose it brought you here. Asterisk, I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and looked around. Her house was full of light. Despite the overcast sky outside, tall windows, potted plants, shelves filled with paperbacks, a teapot sat on the stove, hissing softly. There was a single cup on the counter. Asterisk, would you like tea? She asked. It's chamomile. Asterisk, I hesitated. But something about the moment, maybe the way her voice slowed when she offered it, made me say yes. Asterisk, we sat on her porch, under the awning, while it rained. The tea was hot and slightly sweet. She watched the street like it might offer answers. I kept my gaze on the steam rising from the cup. Asterisk, you don't talk much, she said eventually. Asterisk, I guess I'm still adjusting. Asterisk to what? Asterisk everything, I said. It wasn't much of an answer, but she didn't press. Asterisk, she told me her name was Evelyn. She'd lived in this house since 1981, that she used to teach English at the local high school, that she kept the porch lights on out of habit, not because anyone visited anymore. Asterisk, I told her I used to write code for a company that no longer needed me, that I wasn't sure what came next. Asterisk, I never liked the word retired, she said thoughtfully. Sounds too final. Like you're no longer useful, asterisk. You don't seem useless, I said before thinking. She looked at me amused, and I flushed. I mean, asterisk, I know what you meant, she smiled. Thank you, asterisk. We sat in silence again, but it didn't feel awkward this time. It felt shared. Like two people on different ends of the same long road, pausing for the same quiet breath. Asterisk, when I finally stood to leave, the rain had softened into mist. The sun had dipped low, casting the garden in a golden-soaked glow. I handed her the now empty cup, and she held it for a moment longer than necessary. Asterisk, I'll see you around. I said, asterisk, you will, she replied, and added as if it were just a passing comment, I'm glad the envelope ended up with you. Asterisk, there was something in her voice I didn't understand yet. Not quite invitation, not quite hope. Just something soft, unfinished. Asterisk, as I walked back home through the mist. I found myself glancing back once, just once, to see if she was still standing there on the porch. she was. The days that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't expected. Evelyn would be outside in her garden most mornings, pruning or watering or just kneeling in the dirt like she was listening to something it whispered only to her. I started taking longer walks just to pass by. Sometimes she'd wave, sometimes she wouldn't. But somehow, she always knew when I'd stop. One morning, I offered to fix the gate at the side of her house. The latch was loose, the wood swollen from years of rain. I told her I had tools and time. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "All right, but only if you let me feed you afterward." It became a sort of silent agreement between us. I'd show up with a screwdriver or hammer and stay long after the task was done. She always had coffee ready, strong bitter, exactly how I liked it, though I never told her that. We'd drink it on her porch or by the kitchen window, and the quiet between us grew comfortable like the space after a sigh. Sometimes she'd tell stories from her past, but only in fragments, about how she used to travel alone in her 30s, after her husband died. How she once lived in Italy for a year because she'd fallen in love with the way people there lingered over meals. How she still wrote letters to a friend in Canada she hadn't seen in decades. Her voice always had a certain restraint to it. Not coldness, more like someone who had learned the difference between what needed to be spoken and what didn't. I never asked about her husband again. But once, when I picked up a worn photograph from her mantelhim, smiling in a Navy uniform, she only said, "He was kind." But we were too young to know what to do with kindness. Then, she turned and began dusting something else. Like it had cost her something to say even that. There were moments quiet. Delicate moments when I felt something shift between us, a glance that lasted too long. Pause in our conversation. When her eyes softened, like she saw more in me than I could see in myself. Once, while handing me a mug, her fingers brushed mine, and she didn't pull away immediately. It wasn't flirtation. It was awareness, like both of us were holding something fragile and didn't want to drop it too soon. I found excuses. To stay longer, a leaky faucet, a broken step on her back porch, helping move a heavy planter in her yard. I started coming in the evenings too, when the air turned gold and soft, and the cicadas began their slow hum. We'd sit on the steps and drink whatever she made, sometimes tea, sometimes a quiet glass of wine, and let the conversation trail off. One night, after trimming back a creeping vine that had overtaken her back fence, I stayed late. The sky was darkening, and the moon had just begun to rise over the trees. She came out with 2 cups of warm cider and handed me one, her hand lingering on mine a beat too long. "You're not just fixing things," she said softly. I looked at her. "What am I doing then?" She tilted her head slightly, a small smile at the edge of her mouth. "You're noticing." I didn't know how to respond to that, but it landed somewhere in me. Deep. We sat in silence, the kind that felt full instead of empty. I watched the way the moonlight caught in the fine lines around her eyes, how her breath curled in the cooling air. There was a grace to her stillness, kind of peace I hadn't known I'd been craving until I found it in her presence. At one point, she reached for her shawl draped over the back of the bench, and without thinking, I helped her pull it around her shoulders. My hand brushed her back, light as a breeze. Her eyes met mine, just for a moment, and she whispered, "Thank you." It should have been nothing. Just a small gesture between 2 people sitting quietly beneath a darkening sky. But something in that moment pressed pause on everything else. The noise in my head, the wandering of my heart, even the ache of not knowing where I belonged, all of it quieted. We didn't speak after that. We just sat side by side, close enough that our shoulders touched lightly, like the beginning of a sentence neither of us was ready to finish. And still, we stayed. The storm rolled in without warning. One minute the sky was pale and harmless. The next it was ink dark and pulsing with thunder. I was at home, staring at my ceiling, trying to convince myself I didn't want to go over, that she didn't expect me, that it wasn't my place. Then the lights flickered. The wind slammed against my windows, and for reasons I couldn't explain. I pulled on my jacket and walked down the block. Asterisk, she opened the door before I could knock. Her hair was down, loose for once, curling at her shoulders. She didn't look surprised to see me. She just stepped aside. Asterisk, I was hoping you'd come. Asterisk, the power was already out in her house. She'd lit a few candles, the kind that gave off more scent than light, sandalwood and something faintly floral. The windows rattled with the wind, and rain battered the porch roof like 1,000 tiny fists. She handed me a towel, even though I wasn't soaked. Maybe it gave her hand something to do. I hate storms, she said. Yeah, asterisk. They used to make me feel small. Now they make me feel forgotten. Asterisk, she said it lightly, almost like a joke, but her eyes gave her away. I didn't answer. Just followed her into the kitchen, where she was trying to boil water on a tiny gas burner. The quiet was thick between us, full of unsaid things. We sat at the table, nursing lukewarm tea, the candlelight softening the edges of the room. I watched the shadows play across her face. She looked younger and older at once. Like the years hadn't worn her down, but had simply settled into her bones. Asterisk, can I tell you something? She said suddenly, not looking at me. Asterisk always? Asterisk. I was married for 12 years. We were 24 when we met. He was quiet, not unlike you. She smiled a little. We didn't talk about much, but we laughed a lot. And when he died, I thought the silence would swallow me. Asterisk, I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew silence was what she needed right then, the good kind, the kind that holds space. Asterisk, I spent a long time, convincing myself that I didn't need more, she continued. That desire fades, that companionship was enough. But lately, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm becoming invisible. Like people stop seeing you once your hair turns gray. Like you've already lived everything worth living. Asterisk. I looked at her, really looked at her. The fine lines. Near her mouth, the gentle slope of her shoulders. It's the way she held her cup like it was the only thing tethering her to the present. Asterisk, I see you, I said. Asterisk, her breath caught. She looked down, then away, blinking fast. That's the kind of thing someone says when they don't know better. Asterisk maybe, but I mean it. Asterisk, for a while, we just sat like that. Two people adrift in candlelight while the storm howled outside. And then, as if pulled by something outside of thought, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Asterisk, her skin was soft, warm. The gesture so simple, but it anchored me. I turned my palm to meet hers, and we stayed like that, hands. Linked, quiet breathing, the thunder rolling in the distance like a fading heartbeat. Asterisk, I'm afraid, she whispered. Asterisk of what? Asterisk that if I let someone in again, I won't know how to be anything other than alone. Asterisk, my thumb traced the edge of her hand slowly, gently. You don't have to be anything. Just be here. Asterisk, and then, as naturally as breath, she rose and came around the table. I stood to meet her. There was no hesitation, no rush. She looked up at me, and I saw everything in her eyes: grief, hope, longing, fear, and something even deeper, something like trust. Asterisk. I didn't kiss her the way I had imagined it once or twice when I couldn't sleep. It wasn't urgent or hungry. It was soft, reverent. My hands moved to her back, hers to my chest. We leaned into each other like old trees, steadying after a storm. Asterisk, her lips trembled against mine. Not from cold, but from everything she'd kept locked away. Asterisk, when we pulled apart, she pressed her forehead to mine. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Asterisk, the rain softened. Ate the candle. Flickered. Somewhere in the house, the floor creaked with the wind. Asterisk, we stood there for a long time, holding each other. Not because it led anywhere, not because of desire, but because in that moment, it was enough just to not be alone. The lights never came back on that night, but neither of us noticed. Asterisk. Do you ever wonder if this is just a season for you? She asked one morning, her voice low. The blending with the sound of the kettle hissing behind her. Asterisk, the sun was pouring through the window in gold slants, catching in her hair like threads of fire. I was seated at her kitchen table, peeling an orange slowly, the scent sharp and bright in the air. She stood at the counter, back to me, shoulders tense. Asterisk, what do you mean? I asked, though I knew. Asterisk, she turned, mug in hand, and leaned against the edge of the counter. You're young. Your life's still unfolding. Mine's, she hesitated. Settled, or maybe stuck. I'm not sure anymore. Asterisk, I didn't answer right away. The silence held weight, like the pause before a page. Turns. I watched the way her fingers circled the mug, the faint tremble in her thumb. She didn't look at me. Not quite. She's just near me. Asterisk, Evelyn, I said gently. This isn't a season for me. Something I chose. Asterisk, she exhaled, quiet and uneven, like she didn't believe me yet, but wanted to. Asterisk, we had fallen into a rhythm. Most mornings I'd show up with fresh bread or fruit from the market. She'd make coffee, and we'd sit on the porch, watching the world shuffle past in soft, sleepy steps. She hummed sometimes when she watered her plants. I liked that. Made the air feel alive. Some afternoons we painted together the old garden shed, a couple of chairs. Once a little wooden sign that now hung by her door, uneven but ours. Asterisk, the space between us wasn't filled with grand gestures or declarations. It was in the way I brought in the laundry without asking. The way she remembered how I liked my eggs, runny yolks, slightly burnt edges, and how I touched her lower back when I walked past her in the kitchen. She leaned into it without thinking. Asterisk, but even in comfort, doubt has a way of slipping in quietly. One evening I found her sitting alone in the backyard, legs tucked beneath her, wrapped in that old shawl she wore when she didn't want to talk but needed company. Asterisk, I keep thinking. She murmured, not looking up. What if you wake up one day and feel like you missed something? It's like you were supposed to be somewhere else? Asterisk, I sat beside her, close enough that our shoulders brushed. What if I already did, and this is me getting it right? Asterisk, she didn't answer, but she reached for my hand, and her fingers were cold, but her grip was sure. Asterisk, a few days later, I showed up early. The sky was pale blue, still stretching itself awake. She wasn't expecting me. I found her in the front yard, hair undone, holding a paintbrush, standing in front of the old, faded red door. Asterisk, I've been meaning to do this for years, she said, without turning around. Asterisk, I walked up beside her and reached for the other brush. I'd brought in a paper bag. Asterisk, she looked at me, eyebrows lifted. You knew, asterisk? No, I smiled. I just hoped. Asterisk, we painted in silence, passing the brushes back and forth, the scent of paint thick and sweet. When we finished, the door was a soft, deep blue, something between dusk and ocean. Asterisk, I always hated the red, she said. It felt like pretending. It's asterisk and this. Asterisk, this feels like starting over. It's not pretending anymore. Asterisk, I nodded. Good. Asterisk. The paint dried, and so did the last of her hesitations. That night, she lit candles again, but not because of a storm. We sat in the living room, quiet music in the background, her legs draped across mine. She rested her head on my chest. I could feel her heartbeat through the thin fabric of her sweater, slow, certain. Asterisk, I'm still scared, she whispered. Me too, I said. And that was enough. Neither of us tried to fix it. Just let the fear live in the room without letting it drive us apart. Asterisk, one morning, weeks later, the first snow fell. It came sudden and soft, like a secret being kept. I was already at her place, mug in hand, the smell of cinnamon rolls in the oven. She came up behind me and slid her arms around my waist. Asterisk, it's snowing, she said against my shoulder. Asterisk, I turned to face her, and in the soft light of the kitchen, with the windows fogged and the scent of sugar in the air, I kissed her cheek, then her lips, not rushed, not uncertain. Just ours. Asterisk, we stood at the door together, fingers laced, watching the world turn white. The porch steps were already dusted. The garden hushed under a blanket of quiet. Asterisk, she leaned into me, her head against my chest. Asterisk, I never thought I'd be chosen again, she said. Asterisk, you weren't. I replied, brushing a flake from her hair. You were seen. Asterisk, and we stayed like that, just breathing, just being, as the snow fell and the door behind us dried blue and new. And the warmth between our hands spoke everything words never could. Asterisk.